Good morning, and welcome to POI's fourth webinar in our continuing series. My name is Nick DiGiulio, and I am the EVP of Sales at POI. We are glad you joined us today, with the topic being the learning curve, adapting the educational landscape to support remote learning and well-being. It certainly has been a strange end to the educational year. Celebrations of graduates recognized by a spattering of signs throughout neighborhoods. Rituals of graduation ceremonies, proms, cramming for exams, and year-end celebrations, all pretty well non-existent. It was just about 4 months ago when COVID-19 caused a major shift in the delivery mode of education, as well as the physical classroom environment. Just prior to that, the Ontario government created a raging debate about suggesting a few courses go to e-based learning. It was a shift in thinking and looked like it would be a protracted, contentious discussion. However, the quick spread of COVID-19 created an almost overnight change as educational institutions were scrambling with their classrooms sitting empty. Some adapted quicker than others, but it was a huge stepping stone for everyone. Institutions, teachers, students, and parents all found themselves swimming in very unfamiliar waters. Parents were homeschooling their elementary children. High school students were expected overnight to transition to e-learning. University students migrated back to their parents' home and were finishing their academic studies from their childhood bedroom. So, what does the future hold for education delivery? As Ontario is on the verge of stage 3 opening, there are a lot of very smart educators trying to figure out what the fall semester will look like. Institutions remain challenged to deliver on their promise of education while providing students with ongoing direction and fostering a sense of well-being. Doing this all while maintaining safety. Today, we'll investigate some ideas and thoughts on what education might look like as we navigate the educational landscape with COVID-19 and what it all means for students, teachers, parents, and the custodians of buildings. If you have a question or comment during the presentation, just click on the chat button and write your request or comment, and we will make every effort to answer it. And to start us off, I would like to transition over to Sue Harper, who is POI's VP of Education Sales. Thanks again for being with us today, and enjoy the webinar. Sue, over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Good morning, and thank you for being part of our education webinar this morning. I'm pleased to welcome a number of our education clients covering K-12, higher education, private schools, in addition, corporate clients engaged in upskilling and reskilling initiatives. At POI, we work to deliver a rich assortment of solutions, including our partner Steelcase, who are leaders in research-based design. Today, we are fortunate to have Aileen Strickland McGee speak on the changes occurring in the educational landscape and how our clients and POI are adapting to these changes to deliver solutions which support continuing in learning, including remote learning while keeping safety top of mind. I have had the pleasure of hearing Aileen speak a number of times, and we're fortunate to have her share her research as we explore how to best respond to the ongoing transformations in education and work environments as a whole. Aileen is a senior designer, researcher, and a member of the WorkSpace Futures team at Steelcase. At the end of Aileen's discussion, there will be a panel discussion to answer any questions that you bring up during the webinar. The panel will consist of Aileen, Barry Brennan, the Regional Manager of Education, and myself. Thank you for taking the time with us today, and I welcome Aileen Strickland McGee.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So today we just want to talk to you a little bit about navigating what's next and touch on some of the research that we've done over the last few months, as well as highlight some ways to think about space as we move forward into the fall. And just to let you know, there are resources available, so we're going to go through a lot today, and we're certainly not going to have time to show all of the wonderful applications and ideas that our team has put together, but do know that we have these resources available on our website if you would like to know more. So we'll start out that at its height this spring, almost 1.6 billion learners in over 193 countries were impacted by COVID-19, which is, I mean, it's the entire world. It's been a tremendous life-changing and world-changing event, especially for education. And so today, what we would like to share with you is a few different things. So the first, we want to share with you some of the things that we learned when we engaged in a short research sprint at the end of April, beginning of May, with teachers and students to really understand what their transition to and experience of remote learning in the spring has been like, and taking some of those learnings and thinking about how they might apply to this coming academic year. And then we would love to highlight some of the longer term implications. So after doing a bit of research and foresight there, we want to take a look at what do we think might persist or impact education for a long time to come. Touch on maybe a few near-term impacts for education this fall, and then share some spatial ideas and examples. So we'll all do this all in the next half hour to 35 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion with the panel. So the first thing I'd love to share is the transition to and experience of remote learning and teaching. And so this experience, our central question for this research was we really wanted to understand their transition to and experience of remote learning over the last couple months. And so the ways in which we gathered that data is we use things we call D-Scout missions, which is basically an app on your phone in which students and teachers from all over can answer questions, send in videos, show pictures of their spaces. So we used that as a method. We had a survey, we did interviews, as well as a lot of secondary research. So that's where these insights come from. So the first insight was that the preparedness of schools really set the stage for remote learning and teaching experiences. And so we heard that there was a range of experiences from students and teachers getting a single email to saying, we're doing remote learning now, and nothing else, all the way to a bevy of communication, training, and resources and support along the way. And then the second point, I will go to the next slide to go into a little bit more detail. So here, we also learned that there are key drivers that really set the stage for the experience of remote teaching and learning. One was alignment. So when schools had alignment and clarity about how they were going to proceed forward, it really made for a better remote experience. Even if they were figuring it out as they went along, having as much alignment and clarity as possible were really important. Equitable access. So this was one of the toughest challenges of just making sure that all students had access to the technology, the tools, the Wi-Fi connections to even engage in remote learning. The pedagogies, so schools or individual teachers or classrooms that were already practicing more student-driven pedagogies where students were more self-directed had a bit of an easier time adapting to this remote learning when students were expected to be more self-directed. Familiarity, so obviously familiarity with the digital tools influenced the adoption and full use of the tools, especially with the teachers. And then the last one was really big, was communication. So having transparent, meaningful, and open channels of communication between schools, students, teachers, and parents on the K-12 side was really incredibly important. Again, even if they didn't have the answers, just having those open channels of communication helped build that trust as well. And the second insight we learned from this was that teacher and student well-being is really a critical priority. So students and teachers predominantly felt like this was a challenging and overwhelming experience, probably not surprising. What we did hear, both from the teachers and students, that when the teachers showed adaptability, accessibility, and empathy throughout this, both the student and teachers' experiences were positively impacted. And so here on the screen, you'll see just a few of those words that we had students and teachers describe their experience. So you can see in the red or the pink that words like difficult, challenging, frustrating, stressful were more predominant. And then there were the words in the blue were more positive affect, while the ones in yellow were a little bit more just neutral. And then just a few quotes. So a higher education student saying, "This is especially difficult for me, seeing as I didn't have a home to go back to at first. So it's extremely difficult to worry about passing a class when you are worried about where you're going to lay your head at night." So clearly, very deep well-being issues for some of these students. And then here you see teachers having the same words: difficult, challenging, frustrating. And then the third insight was around clarity, flexibility, communication, and effective use of robust digital tools made a big difference in the remote learning experience. So having a balance of clear structure and flexibility for the teacher and for the student, along with a strong communication, again, that theme of communication, were key elements of a successful remote experience. So we heard that students still needed some structure and what to expect, but they also needed some flexibility in that because, this was a completely new situation. And then also the effective use of digital tools and platforms impacted that remote experience. And so a K-12 teacher saying that the best thing I did was sit down with my stated learning outcomes, decide how I could still accomplish them with an online format. So displaying some of that flexibility for the situation, yet still bringing that structure. And then around some of those digital use of tools, one of the things was standardizing on one remote learning platform. So we heard from especially higher ed students, their instructors and faculty might be using different platforms, so they had to figure out how to use multiple platforms, which class was with which platform, and it was a bit much. Providing training for the teachers and faculty to use this. And so we heard that both from the teachers and the students saying that the faculty needed more help on how to use these tools. And then maximizing the use of these tools. So using the features like the chat feature or the coming up with video etiquette and how to present in class. All of those different things made a difference to how that experience unfolded. Then the fourth is centered around the physical space. So we heard a lot that the physical space is more than just a learning space. And we heard this in a few ways. So the spaces were placed in connection. The number one thing we heard was that I miss my friends, I miss my colleagues, I miss being around my students, and really missing that face-to-face, which again, isn't surprising, but we heard that very loud and clear, and that these physical spaces weren't just about the learning, but it was about the people. And then also that these spaces harness a collective energy and spontaneity that's present that can't be replicated. So being in the same space as people, learning together has an intangible energy that you just can't get when you're isolated at home. And then also that sort of spontaneity. So teachers remarking that they, when in person, they're able to react in real time to and see the body language of a student who might not be understanding something, and be able to, sort of spontaneously, organically help in that situation where that was removed when it was done via screen. We also heard from students that just getting dressed and going to a different space outside of their house really influenced their motivation to do the work. So it was an interesting sort of parallel to think about the moving of the physical space into a learning space actually being a mindset shift as well, and an indicator of motivation to learn. And then the last one was an ecosystem of learning spaces have a lot of affordances that are missing at home. So we heard, I miss being able to go to different places to learn, and they would name, you know, the library, outside, a classroom, the hall, the media center, whatever it was, and just having that variety and choice. And we also heard, especially from teachers, that they missed a lot of the ergonomic and different affordances and support that their classroom or office helped afford them on campus, and that they weren't getting that at home. And so here's just a couple quotes. Higher education students saying the on-campus experience is so much more. It's a gazillion things: your job, your friends, going up to campus events or doing things on campus, being with other students, trying new things, studying session, being with people. So again, so much more than just learning, and really a bit of a sense of living. And K-12 teachers saying, I miss seeing my students every day, talking to them about their lives, their achievements, their fears, seeing them graduate, showing me their prom dresses, all of these small moments that really foster and build those relationships and connections. And then here, a student putting it quite dramatically, saying that it just feels like the soul of learning has been ripped out by learning from remotely. And then you'll see some snippets of photos that teachers sent us from some of their own teaching environments. So you can see that some actually have a desk and a desk chair, but more often than not, these environments were set up in their bedroom, on their couch, on the kitchen counter, a desk inside of a closet, their living room piano, as well as a makeshift green screen in their dining room. So you can see that, you know, why the teachers might have said that they were missing a lot of affordances that they had in their on-campus environments. And then the last insight as a part of this project was that a hybrid and blended learning experience built on student-centered pedagogy is really best for the future. And so while we heard overwhelmingly that, you know, students and teachers wanted to be back face-to-face, they did start to see more value in what the virtual learning experience could offer. And so there certainly were positives there, as well as it helped focus on experiences that are building the 21st century skills that both teachers and students need. So things like resiliency, adaptability, you know, whether they wanted to practice them or not, they were thrown into a situation where they were learning how those skills and how to practice them. And so both teachers and students were marking that this was something that they recognized that they need to build even when they do return to a physical school. So here you can see some of the leveraging the strengths of both. So on the virtual side, some of the things that we heard was, you know, you can have expanded and enriched exploration online with all of the different resources at our fingertips. Repetition and reflection, so students being able to go back to things as they need it. Control of place and pace. So again, some students really remarking that they liked the recorded lectures so they could go back and listen, take notes, rewind, that really helped them. Having a central hub for communication and resources, as well as a lower cost of delivery. But then the face-to-face, again, had those things that just couldn't be replicated. So those physical interactions, social connections, nonverbal cues, that immediate feedback, that spontaneity and collective energy, and then just hands-on learning and all of the things that happen outside of the learning experience that just, again, cannot be replicated online. So now we want to kind of shift a little bit to looking at what happened in the spring, to then looking kind of farther out and how COVID-19 and this pandemic might impact education in the long term. So we'll go over 6 points here, and I'll quickly talk through them. So one is that there's new ways of teaching and learning. So, you know, some schools had already been experimenting with and using a lot of virtual or blended or digital learning, but all schools were thrown into this into the deep end, whether they were on that journey or not. And so while we don't necessarily think that all learning is going to be remote in the future, we do know that this is probably going to have a tremendous impact on the ways in which people think about the learning and teaching experience, what happens on campus, what can be done remotely, and really questioning what value it brings on campus to bring people together and be learning together. So again, kind of that last slide of the best of both worlds. We see education continuing to move in that direction, in some more than others. The second is just developing those needed skills and dispositions. So this is something that we and schools have been talking about for quite a while. Our last research project actually last year was all around this topic of upskilling and learning organizations, and how do students and workers gain these 21st century skills, things like how to learn, again, adaptability, resilience, socio-emotional learning, collaboration, creativity, things like that, grit, growth mindset. And so you see that in this moment that a lot of that is having to be practiced, and it can be deeply uncomfortable, but schools recognizing that these are the types of skills that we need to be able to arm not just our students with, but also our teachers, because we are living. It's no longer a future that's volatile and uncertain. We are living in the present that's volatile and uncertain. And it's really important for students and teachers to have these skills in order to thrive now and into the future. Certainly a tremendous focus on well-being. So this is something that we are currently researching at the moment, and we're doing actually before this spring, and we know that the well-being crisis was growing and growing, and more schools were thinking and wanting to tackle that. And then when COVID-19 happened, it actually then just added more stress and anxiety to an already tenuous situation within education around well-being. And so we see that in the future, this focus on well-being and really needing to nurture the whole student, the teacher, those relationships, and then even out into the community with the parents and et cetera, because it's all interconnected, is going to be extremely important to continue to focus on, and will continue to grow. The fourth is facing issues of inequity. So, you know, these issues around within education of inequity were already present in different ways for K-12 and higher ed, and certainly different in various countries around the world. But it really has exacerbated some of those already existing inequities. So schools that, you know, or students that maybe don't have the same access to the tools or technology that other students might have. And that really made a big difference in this immediate of if a student didn't have access to a tool or an internet connection, they couldn't actually even engage in learning, which obviously is a big issue. And then even some of the other issues, that the role that schools play in society with childcare, perhaps providing meals and all of that, and that really being strained by these other things happening, has put a brighter spotlight on the inequities within the education system, and how do we ensure that all students are getting the education that they deserve. The fifth around longstanding structures being stressed. So again, these are things that have existed pre-COVID, but COVID has just sort of exacerbated some of these around, especially around like financial instability. And so the ways in which schools may be funded, or the business models of higher ed and relying on tuition, and now students are perhaps starting to make different decisions or this fall, or not even coming to school, is obviously hurting the funding and the resources that schools have to do what they need. And some of this was already was under pressure before this, but certainly this pandemic has exacerbated some of that. And then the last one I'll just touch on is the emerging partnerships. So again, this is a trend that we saw starting to happen pre-COVID, but having this experience, perhaps having private and public entities coming together in new ways to solve these really complex problems, like inequity and is not an easy problem, and it's not just up to the schools to solve, but how can the community itself, businesses, community partners, schools all start to solve these things together. And so an example of this is here in the States, there was out on the West Coast, there was a private tech company that started to bring broadband access to rural areas where students just didn't have access to the internet, or not a reliable internet anyway. And so they had partnered with the school districts out there to help bring that access to those students so that they could engage in learning, for example. And so we expect to see more and more of this sort of thing happening as time goes on. And so these longer term implications don't necessarily give us answers, yet they really cause us to ask new questions, which lead to new exploration. So questions like, how might we imagine blended experiences and learning tools that can easily toggle between on-campus and off-campus? How might the increased awareness of emphasis on well-being during this crisis impact the strategic prioritization of well-being for institutions? How might institutions accelerate their adoption on student-centered, personalized learning experiences to have students and educators practice and develop these critical skills and dispositions? How might spaces on campus adapt quickly as enrollment on campus residency fluctuates? How might new partnerships between private and public sectors be necessary to solve some of the most pressing issues in education? And so these are just some of the questions, and there's many more. And if you have them, please save them to the Q&A. Maybe we can talk through them together. And then this next bit, I just want to touch on some of the nearer term impacts. And so these are things that your school might be discussing, or you might be hearing from your children's schools. And so here's some of the things that we are hearing. And this is within the US, there's the Chronicle of Higher Education is keeping track of what colleges are deciding, and are they planning for in-person hybrid model. And this was a graph pulled from the 7th, and a lot has happened even here in the States in the last 7 days. So this might even be a little bit different now as cases here rise. But you can start to see like what other schools and what other, in this case, universities in the US are looking to do. So one, we know that we're going to see remote and hybrid models of learning this fall and certainly throughout the spring. And again, we expect to see that as a long-term impact, but certainly this fall right away. And that's what people are experimenting with now. Stepped up hygiene and health measures, so things like temperature checks, different cleaning protocols, things like that. Smaller class sizes, spaced farther apart. So we'll talk just a bit about that in a few minutes when I share some applications. Staggered schedules, so schools, not having students come back all day for 5 days a week, but perhaps having more of a rotational model with their time being home part of the time and being in person part of the time. Some schools talking about starting earlier and trying to end earlier before perhaps flu season really starts to pick up steam in November and December. Obviously, no large events, which is kind of devastating when you think about all of the different things that exist just outside the learning environment in school. But no large events. Having different well-being supports. We talked a little bit about how important thinking about the psychological and physical safety of well-being certainly are in the immediate for both students and teachers. And then using more outdoor and perhaps isolation spaces, so that I know that in Canada and certainly here in the northern US, the outdoor spaces, there's a limited time to use those, but how might those be used even in the first couple months of classes resuming. And then if somebody does get sick or does exhibit symptoms, where can they go to be isolated more immediately so that it doesn't present a danger to other students and teachers and staff. And so just very quickly in the next 5 minutes or so, 5 or 7 minutes, I just want to share some of our spatial applications and the ways that we've been thinking about as schools are needing to make decisions about what this fall looks like and how their spaces are going to have to shift because it has a huge implications on space. What might be some of the things to think about? And again, this is not a full deck. We've got a lot more that we can share with you. And we also have that resource that I shared earlier. But here's just a sampling. So very quickly, some of the considerations that we have when talking about these spaces is thinking about density, thinking about geometry, and thinking about division. So density, creating that 6 feet or 2 meters of distance between people, thinking about how we might use larger open spaces for group meetings, leveraging flexible furniture, and then thinking about where appropriate, where might there be more own spaces so that people aren't sharing things as much as they were, pre-COVID. And so you can see this space plan on the left is pre-COVID and post-COVID, and we won't spend too much time on this, but just to sort of share that, if you've got a learning environment, you can see the blue circle on the right, perhaps those environments start to spill out into those other areas. So the classroom walls actually start to kind of go away, and other spaces within the school or adjacent to those classrooms are starting to be used as the learning spaces as well. We anticipate that people have more perhaps controlled circulation or different footpaths, closing off entrances and exits just to ensure that they have a little bit more control of the movement of people through those spaces. Geometry, so just reorienting furniture and separating those desks with sort of simple principles there. And so you can see that, perhaps staggering those rows on the right and pulling those desks a little bit further apart. Again, that decreases the density inside the classrooms because classrooms might be going from 25 to 30 students down to, 12 to 15, things like that. And so that's where that idea of staggered schedules or using various spaces throughout campus or throughout the building on a more rotational model come into play. So you can see here just sort of a quick comparison of where pre-COVID and then just not necessarily getting anything new, but rearranging some things and maybe putting a couple different panels up for division. And so sanitation stations, a ton of ideas for different types of sanitation stations, both flexible and perhaps more permanent. And then division, so adding space division, so creating some of those barriers in existing learning, movable screens, and then just things that perhaps are a little bit more height, like you see in a grocery store or something like that, where you've got a little bit of that physical barrier between people. And so there's a lot of different ways that this can be done again, and they can be not just screens, but they could also be usable surfaces like whiteboards, and so they can be used for learning, but they're also playing a dual role of perhaps some of that physical separation that doesn't feel as onerous, but feels a bit more natural. And then there are, if needed, plexiglass or things like that, separation screens, if schools are choosing to go that route. So here, just very quickly, here's some applications. So taking out chairs, staggering the rows a bit, using, like we've got the verb just as those dividers, still orienting, but things are pulled a little bit further apart. And you'll see some screens here in both of those scenarios. Again, a flipped classroom, so you've got different stations. Not everybody's doing the same thing. You've got a camera at the front that might be broadcasting out to people who are remote. Same thing here, just kind of adding division, pulling those desks apart. Another example of a rotational model. So again, you kind of see that it's not just about having a monolithic environment, but still having that variety and richness, but just thinking about, again, that density and geometry and division and how that might work within some of these spaces, still built for active, engaged learning. And not just the classrooms, but perhaps student common areas and collaborative areas, adding biophilic elements. So space division, again, doesn't just have to be a screen, but it could actually be plants and things like that. Again, here a little bit less dense in the cafes. And then even some pop-up learning spaces. So using gyms or hallways or dead spaces before for these pop-up learning spaces as students need to be moved out of the classroom, but moved somewhere within the building. So that was the cafeteria. Here's perhaps a gym with 3 separate classes, and you can see some division there. And so again, that was a little bit of a quick glance, but we have a lot more to share with you there if you're interested. But again, here's that resource one more time if you want to dig a little bit deeper into that and get even more ideas for how those spaces might transform in the immediate future. So now I'm going to throw it back over to Stephanie for the panel discussion.
Thanks, Aileen. That was an awesome presentation, and I definitely learned a few new things throughout that. So thank you for sharing your expertise. Before we start, I'd like to just quickly reintroduce our lovely panel who will be helping answer some of the questions that have come throughout the presentation. So first we have Sue Harper, the VP of Education and Healthcare here at POI. We also have Barry Brennan, Steelcase Regional Manager Education. And we finally have our terrific host, Aileen Strickland McGee, Senior Design Researcher with the Steelcase WorkSpace Futures team. So I've seen some really great questions come through, and I think the first one I'm going to send over to Barry. The question here that I think Barry will be perfect to answer is, if online blended learning becomes more prevalent and accepted as a result of this experience, how might this impact the teaching and learning experience at education institutions?
Really good question. One that you could probably talk about for a really long time as well. I think it's fair to say that what happened when COVID first arrived is that people really leapt into emergency teaching, but not necessarily beneficial or really impactful online learning. So I think a lot of the change to making things like solely online or even blended learning happen is really rests with teachers. And as Aileen mentioned in her presentation, there are certainly people who have been ahead of the game and have already been providing great experiences online as part of a student's educational experience. But other folks, and I don't know if you can generalize, I'm an old guy, so maybe you can, but I think older teachers tend to be generally a little less familiar with some of the tools and so on. So I think they were essentially taking the way they had taught before and just put themselves on video. So I think the pedagogical issue, which we at Steelcase think still is the most important thing when it comes to great learning, is a key thing. So professional development for folks, providing safe environments for them to practice. That could be things like studios within a school where you could learn to do this with maybe somebody professionally producing purely online stuff that's not synchronous. And then I think from the synchronous learning perspective, there's a number of different models around the world that people are considering. Some of you may know about HighFlex, which is a model where maybe half the students in a room are actually in the room listening to the teacher, but then typically a lot of extra technology is embedded in the room so that at the same time, those students who aren't able to be there or maybe part of the other half who aren't there that day they are still in class. It's just they're they're learning online in real time. It's just they're not physically facing the teacher. So hopefully that answers that question. Any other opinions, Eileen?
No, I mean, I think that you hit on a lot of the big ideas. Again, I think that one of the things that we are hearing on this is that, in the spring, it was sort of, yeah, like you said, that emergency, we're just thrown into it. And as much as people can prepare for the fall, but they recognize that they're not going to have all of those answers. And that's far from realistic to ask of schools and teachers and students. And so I think even using this year, again, to think about what are we learning? So instead of feeling like they've got to get it right now this fall, approaching it with more of that agile and design thinking mindset around, we're going to try these things out. We're going to see what works for us, because what works for one teacher might not work for another, but allow this to really be learning period to start to think about what works for us as a school, what works for me as a teacher, and not expect that it's going to be perfect right out of the gates at all.
Something else that is worth mentioning, and I think it probably could be an issue with every question that might be asked today, is where's the money coming from to do this? Because certainly here in Ontario, where we know the education budget has been constrained, and we know that one of the big fears a lot of schools have is that they may lose sometimes up to 30% of their revenues, because some people will decide not to come to school this year. Maybe international students can't get here. People decide to take a gap year and so on. But even when enrollment was at capacity, the government, if anything, has tended to cut budgets for education. So buying a whole bunch of stuff is expensive, but so is the cost of training. And I heard today that here in Toronto, the TDSB, as we are speaking, is debating whether they're going to use in-person, online, or some combination of things. But apparently, if the number that I heard is if they wanted to implement a fully face-to-face model, they would have to hire 1,000 teachers and need $100 million for that. And that's just at the TDSB here in Toronto. And I know it's the biggest school board, and there's 250,000 students. But these are real issues. And I think one thing that Eileen would also agree with is that we're very sensitive to the cost implications of all this. So we do have some schools who want to buy a few things, maybe some screens, or maybe they want to swap out desks that used to seat 2 people for 1 and so on. But generally speaking, I think most people are hoping that this is not a permanent change, because the cost is just too high. And then what do you do with stuff that may be fairly unique afterwards? So we're very sensitive to that. So in some of the applications that we'll show you, you'll see what I think are great ideas. But what I would suggest is that you take from those images things that are doable at your school or at your company. Be very careful how you spend that money. Look for alternatives. You don't necessarily have to buy the most expensive options to accommodate the same things. But anyway, we're hoping that this thing gets under control if a vaccine does arrive, but I'm pretty sure we're stuck with this current situation for at least another 9 months, maybe 6, if some miracle happens.
Exactly. Let's hope for a miracle. Make it quicker than later, but we'll work with what we can. Actually, Barry, don't go anywhere. There's another question here that I think you'd be great to answer. The question reads, in what ways do you see the physical environments on campuses changing or staying the same?
Well, I'd like to say I knew exactly what the answer was, and it was the right answer. I don't think people really know. I mentioned the TDSB is debating this now, and when you think about it, that's 6-7 weeks away from the start of school. And this pandemic has been impacting us since the middle of March. So you think they might have jumped on this a bit earlier. So I think, Eileen in her slides had some great suggestions for near-term solutions, and they're not that different than you might find in corporate environments, or even when you go to the store, for example, to pick up groceries. So, things like separating people, whether it's 6 feet or whether it's going to be 3 eventually, or you may know that we've recently contracted with a scientist at MIT who specializes in fluid dynamics, and she's going to be looking at really how far the spread of some of these aerosols and droplets go. So that 6 or 3 feet could be 26 feet, we don't know. But I think separating students, another question, and Aileen answered it, I think, in some respects by suggesting that people use spaces like gymnasiums and cafeterias and maybe borrowing some space from larger circulation pathways. That's one way we may be able to accommodate that. I think the addition of barriers, I haven't found in my own discussions with most of those of you on the line from schools I have met, have huge appetites to buy a lot of barriers. But I think there are things, for example, like whiteboards that you may own that are already mobile that you'll probably use. I think within classrooms, another strategy is simply to just change the orientation of students one from another. So you're not facing someone, you may be facing away from them. And then I think the longer term implications are going to be partly driven by the development of high performance blended learning experiences for students. And then that gets into questions about, well, if I don't need all this real estate, what do I do with it? It may mean that there are partnering opportunities for either schools to use some of their real estate to help others in the economy, or vice versa. So I think, most of us are pretty familiar with things that are likely to happen in the very short term because it's been published to death. I think once you get beyond 6-9 months, and certainly preparing for the pandemic after this one, I think the jury's still out on what the suggestions are for that.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, and those are all really great points, Barry, that again, looking a little bit longer term, I think people both in the corporate side of things and certainly within education really think about what is the value of bringing people together. And I think that what people are learning about the value that remote or online or virtual learning experiences can add, people are discovering the strengths and weaknesses of that. And so certainly a lot more of those hybrid, and we've mentioned that before, but I think especially as for, and it's different in lower grades than it is for higher ed, but why are people going to come to campus? I think digging deeper, and I think when you think about that graph I showed with the face-to-face and physical, those things that cannot be replicated in a remote or digital way, that actually becomes a heightened value that physical spaces can offer, and in turn, those might be the things that, especially within higher ed, they're going to have to think more intentionally about around how are we creating these hands-on experiences or these multi-dimensional supports for our students for well-being that they can't just get online, because if it's just about content or knowledge, that can be offloaded a lot easier, but there's all of these other things. And so the value that physical campuses have actually starts to shift to support new experiences and new behaviors. Again, looking a little bit farther long term at that.
For sure. I think there's actually a question here that relates to a little bit of how we're supporting learning going forward. And I think Sue is a great one to answer this question. So the question reads, how is POI as a solutions provider managing the short-term needs of educational clients? What recommendations do you have for us to support learning during the crisis?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as we all realize, we're in uncharted territory here, but we can be extremely nimble. And with all of our clients, we can go into the corporate learning or into the classrooms currently, and we're working with educators to help them do planning now. With a design team at POI, we can do some spatial drawings for them so that we can work with you on any items that you currently have and make suggestions. I think it's really important as we go through COVID-19 that we really define how we can do a good example of the classroom now or the corporate learning environment now, and how we can move it into the future when things change. You know, we're all hoping that things come back together. Nobody wants to spend a lot of money making huge changes, but we are here to help both from an audiovisual standpoint and plus spatial planning to help with what you have today and maybe help you make some small changes that will help you manage this COVID world that we're living in. And, you know, because we work with so many partners, we can help you with all of the things that you need, whether it's whiteboards and flip-top tables and spatial planning, as POI has so many resources that we can help you with currently today. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it does for sure. Thank you, Sue. There's a question here that I think, Aileen, I'm going to send this one over to you. Jess asked this question, and she says, in all reality, how likely are children going to maintain social distancing, even when proper protocols and spacing are in place? Also, wouldn't less dense classrooms require more teachers? Are there any plans in place for recruiting more teachers?
So those are great questions. So I think on sort of the first part of that question, that's a challenge. I think that what, you know, like especially we're even starting to see this in the US of some of the newer outbreaks here have been younger, you know, people in their 20s going to parties and going to bars. And those are things that schools necessarily like of higher ed cannot control. And so I think there's part of that of saying like, here are the things that we can control and placing it in the context of that reality that there are going to be, you know, in higher ed, the students' behaviors they can't control, all of that. Certainly with younger students, I think, you know, being as careful as they can if they're with them for longer and, you know, or with their parents, there's perhaps a little bit more control there. But I do think that that's something, especially within higher education, that they have to deeply consider when they're thinking about reopening their campuses, because it's where students live and socialize in a different type of way. And it is a really tough, there's no easy answer to that, but certainly should be a part of that consideration and what can be within their control and what isn't, and what happens, and sort of doing some scenario planning for what happens if there is an outbreak or cases do go up. How does that school respond? So it's not just what are they going to do now, but also how are they going to respond as things change or unfold over the semester, because this is a very dynamic situation. And as far as the second part of the question around the less density does not necessarily equal that there has to be more teachers. It really comes back to that pedagogy. And so it might look different, again, with younger students who might actually need a little bit more of that supervision because they're 7 years old. But what that looks like for 12-year-olds or 17-year-olds, hopefully, they are able to have a little bit more autonomy. And I think that's where that conversation around what are those skills and dispositions that schools are wanting to build in their students. And so that's where that student-centered and personalized pedagogy comes in. And we've got a bunch of research on this. That part of that is, you know, if you've got 25 students in a classroom, and let's say they're all there at the same time, but they can't physically be in the same room, and you've only got one, you still have got one teacher because you don't have the resources to hire other teachers. How can technology help there? So is there something that those students who are not right there doing that technology can help do, whether that's online lessons or perhaps using peer-to-peer, and maybe even at the school level, it's taking a different look at how teachers are actually organized across the spaces. So do schools actually think a little bit differently about, instead of just having one teacher for 25 students, do they actually organize themselves a bit differently to think about how those experiences are happening so that they're meeting the needs of their students? Because every school is doing something different. So it's a little hard to say, you know, in full detail, but I think that there's different ways that schools can think about solving for it versus just kind of thinking in the box like, okay, we've divided thing in two, we've got to solve it the same way. It's actually a new problem, and how can you kind of step back and find more creative solutions, again, through technology, through the pedagogy, through the organization of your personnel, things like that, and your spaces. So I hope that at least touches on your question.
Yeah, for sure. That was a very well answered question to many questions in one. So just keeping the time in mind, I'm going to ask one more question and send it to Aileen again, and that will conclude the Q&A portion. So Aileen, the last question here is it clear what needs to happen, either government or statistic-wise, to determine whether schools will reopen in September or if online learning will continue?
Oh man, if I had the answer for that, that'd be in all the news stations. No, I mean, I think, again, this is an extremely multifaceted and complex issue. And I think that there are certainly, you know, evidence-based, as much as they can, guidelines that are being put out there. But it really is going to be up to schools to take all of that information, you know, into consideration and say, what is the best for our students, our staff, our faculty? Getting their input, I think, is really important, because I think especially now, you know, teachers don't always feel heard in these. So certainly making sure that they're hearing their students and their teachers and what their fears and trepidations are, what they're excited about, and using that as a source of information. And certainly in K-12 with parents, I mean, opening up those conversations, as we pointed out at the very beginning of the slide I started sharing, was that open and transparent communication being really critical to building that trust within and across their community. And so I think, yeah, it's going to have to be a balance of what is right for a school or a district and their people, while also recognizing what are the governmental, you know, things that they have to perhaps abide by. And again, not just deciding that now for the fall, but having those contingency plans or planning and knowing that, you know, something might change as we get into this in September or October, and how are we going to respond to that, and having those plans so they're not caught, you know, not that they have to have all of the answers, but they have to have, what are those good questions that we need to be asking and thinking about. And again, that's sort of a whole different skill set that perhaps schools are just building, is that response to being agile and resilient. And this is all part of that. So again, doing the best they can now with the information they have, but have some plan in place to revisit that continuously as a dynamic process throughout the fall and the next academic year, for sure.
Aileen, just one more point on that, and this
has
nothing to do with teaching or learners and so on, but one of the issues that I think will have to be cleared up pretty soon is daycare. Because, you know, I mean, any of you folks online who have small children, I had an interesting question the other night. What do I do if my school goes to a staggered week, so 3 days 1 week, 2 days next, but I have multiple children? What if they're not on the same schedule?
Right.
So I think these issues are much bigger in many respects than simply you know, dealing with the practical aspects of the virus and infection rates.
These are definitely workplace issues too, and we're seeing these conversations and having them ourselves, you know, on the corporate side of things, because parents are employed at these companies, and so again, I think this just really shows the interconnection of our systems, our working, our education, and how really placing them in a larger context and considering all of these different things is really important to be thinking about.
Well, thanks for everyone. Thanks, Aileen, for that insightful presentation. It looks like we've gone right to the hour. Thanks to Barry of Steelcase and Sue of POI for being on the question and answer panel, and for Stephanie navigating those questions. We had a number of questions that we haven't gotten to. We'll have our education team here at POI in conjunction with Steelcase try to get answers to those and provide them back to you. Best probably way would be to contact your local representative to follow up on anything that you learned today. And we appreciate you taking the time to spend with us and look forward to seeing you soon. Have a great rest of the day. Stay healthy, happy, and good luck in dealing with all of the challenges that you face. Bye for now.